They laughed, convinced she would smile, stay quiet, and let their words pass. But when she took the mic, the air in the room shifted. Every chuckle died, every gaze dropped, and the people who had reduced her to a punchline suddenly found themselves exposed. Stay with us, because what began as a moment meant to put her in her place became the night she claimed it instead. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated, and then proven, without a shout, that you belonged all along? The sprawling coastal estate seemed to float above the ocean, its white pillared facade catching the afternoon light, like a scene from a postcard. Beyond the wrought iron gates, a winding drive curved through gardens so precise they looked painted, hedges clipped into perfect symmetry, roses climbing over trellises in deliberate bursts of color, fountains murmuring in the breeze. The scent of salt mingled with blooming jasmine, wrapping the air in a perfume money couldn't buy, but wealth could certainly curate. It was the night of the Whitmore family's annual gala, a tradition older than many of its guests. For generations, the event had been a display of power dressed in refinement, pearls strung over evening gowns, cufflinks passed down like heirlooms, conversations laced with old alliances and quiet rivalries. Champagne glasses caught the light from the chandeliers overhead, and the music drifting from the grand hall was the kind of string arrangement chosen not for passion, but for polish. Everything about the night whispered legacy, exclusivity, and the unshakable confidence of people who believed their place in the world had been decided long before they were born. Naomi Whitmore stepped from the car into this world, like a burst of emerald against a canvas of ivory and gold. Her gown, a fluid sweep of silk, seemed to move even when she stood still, catching the light with every turn. Her skin, deep and luminous, glowed under the setting sun's last rays, the kind of beauty that didn't need adornment but wore it anyway. Gold earrings brushing the line of her jaw, a simple bracelet clasped at her wrist. She moved with an ease that wasn't born from this environment but had been honed to meet it, a grace that belonged to her no matter where she stood. Beside her, Daniel placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, his touch both protective and proud. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, his smile the kind that could disarm strangers and infuriate rivals. But even with him there, Naomi felt the subtle shift in the air as they entered the grand hall. Conversation slowed, then resumed at a fraction of their previous volume. Eyes flicked toward her, not the curious glances given to new acquaintances, but the quick, assessing looks of people cataloging difference.
To many of the Whitmores, Naomi was still the outsider. Not because she lacked elegance or intelligence, though she had in abundance, but because she had not been raised within their gilded walls. Her roots were in a world where respect was earned through work, not inherited titles. She had built herself from the ground up long before she met Daniel. That truth, unspoken but undeniable, set her apart here. She was tolerated in these rooms, even admired by a few, but embraced by none. As they crossed the marble floor toward the heart of the party, she caught fragments of polite greetings. "You look lovely tonight, Naomi," from an aunt whose smile never reached her eyes. A lingering handshake from a cousin who managed to make admiration sound like surprise. There were compliments, yes, but they were laced with a subtext she'd learned to read fluently, words that acknowledged her presence without ever granting her belonging. Naomi let each one pass over her like water off glass. Her posture remained perfect, her smile warm but measured. She had promised herself long ago that she would not shrink in these moments, would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her bend under the weight of their unspoken judgments. Instead, she let her gaze sweep the room, the glittering chandeliers, the sea of designer gowns, the glint of silverware catching candlelight. She might not have been born into this world, but she knew how to navigate it. And tonight, whether they liked it or not, she would take her place in it. From the moment Naomi crossed the threshold into the Whitmore ballroom, the shift was immediate. The grand space was a cathedral to excess, vaulted ceilings painted in scenes of classical mythology, crystal chandeliers that glowed like captive constellations, a marble floor polished to a mirrored shine. Yet for all its beauty, the room seemed to bristle at her presence. The first wave came in the form of quick glances, eyes that swept over her gown, her skin, her hand in Daniel's, then darted away as if the looking itself might be caught and questioned. The second wave followed close behind. Polite smiles that held just a fraction too long, the edges tight, brittle. She knew the language well. It was the kind that spoke without speaking, that dressed disapproval in manners. Along the walls, the Whitmore family history stared down from ornate, gilded frames. Generations of pale faces gazed into the distance with the same steel-blue eyes, the same aristocratic tilt of the chin, the same assurance that they belonged here because they always had. The air itself seemed to hum with their approval, or lack thereof. Naomi's reflection, caught in the glass of a portrait's frame, felt like a quiet rebellion. She didn't belong in those frames, and many in the room wanted her to remember that. She kept moving, her steps slow enough to match Daniel's but steady enough to claim space as her own. They passed clusters of relatives and family friends, conversations dimming to a murmur that swelled again only when she'd gone by. The sound was a ripple of silk skirts and clinking crystal, threaded through with the low hum of whispers that fizzled as soon as her ears might catch them. Then came the laughter. It rose from the far side of the hall, where a knot of cousins and their spouses stood around a silver bucket of champagne. It was too loud, too sudden, the kind of laughter that didn't emerge naturally but was sharpened into a weapon before it was released. Naomi didn't need to hear the words to know she was the subject. She had felt this before, in boardrooms where she was the only black woman at the table, at country club luncheons where her invitation had clearly been a reluctant formality.
Daniel's hand pressed a little more firmly at her back, a silent gesture that said he heard it too. But neither of them broke stride. Grace was her armor, and she wore it well, but even armor couldn't make her impervious. The stairs tonight carried a different weight, a sharper edge than before. Perhaps it was because this was the first gala since she had begun taking on more public work, lending her name and influence to causes the Whitmores liked to avoid. Causes that drew uncomfortable attention to the kind of wealth and privilege they preferred to keep untouched. She felt the pressure of every gaze, the appraisal, the quiet calculations. They were measuring her against the invisible standards they carried in their bones. Naomi didn't intend to pass their test. She intended to make her own. And as she moved deeper into the ballroom, under the painted ceiling and the watchful eyes of both the living and the dead, she knew she was not here to blend in. She was here to be seen, whether they welcomed it or not. Dinner was served in the east wing of the estate, where the long banquet table gleamed beneath a chandelier so vast it seemed to have been lowered from the heavens. Thousands of crystal prisms caught the light, scattering gold across the polished silverware and bone china. The air was warm with the scent of truffle butter and roasted lamb, underpinned by the soft strains of a string quartet tucked discreetly in the corner. Conversation ebbed and flowed like a practiced tide, rising just enough to fill the room without ever drowning out the music. Naomi sat between Daniel and one of his aunts, her posture flawless, her smile polite but reserved. At the head of the table, the Whitmore patriarch, Thomas Whitmore, rose to his feet with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who never had to rush for anyone. The room quieted instantly. Even the quartet softened, their bows hovering midair as though in deference. He held his glass aloft, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, his empire in human form. He began in the same way he had every year, with a toast to the family's legacy, to their name, to what he called their unshakable traditions. His voice carried the weight of decades spent being listened to, every word polished by a lifetime of expectation. Guests leaned forward, expressions lit with the shared understanding of privilege, nodding at all the familiar lines they had heard since childhood. Naomi listened without shifting, her eyes fixed on the flicker of the candles set in silver candelabras down the length of the table. The words were smooth, untroubled, yet she felt a faint tightening in her chest, a reminder that this speech was less a celebration than a reaffirmation of who belonged here and why. Then, just as Thomas lowered his glass in a gesture of finality, a voice rang out from halfway down the table. "And here's to Daniel," called out Richard Whitmore, one of Daniel's older cousins, his grin wide, his tone dripping with false camaraderie. "Proving we can even diversify the family portfolio." The room erupted in laughter, not the warm kind that spills from genuine amusement, but the sharp, knowing kind that slices at its target while pretending it's all in good fun. The sound rolled over the table in waves, punctuated by a few smothered chuckles and sidelong glances. Naomi felt the sting instantly, though her expression didn't so much as flicker. Daniel stiffened beside her, his jaw tightening, his knuckles whitening around the stem of his wineglass. Across the table, someone covered their mouth, hiding a smile that didn't belong to them. The laughter ebbed after a moment, but its residue lingered, a film that clung to the air. Naomi lifted her glass in a measured gesture, meeting Richard's eyes for the briefest moment. There was no smile on her lips, no outward sign of offense, yet the silence between them felt heavier than the crystal in her hand. She took a slow sip, the cool wine a sharp contrast to the heat that had risen in her chest. Around her, the conversation resumed, as though nothing had happened. Forks scraped against plates, the quartet picked up their melody, and the Whitmore name carried on being toasted in subtle, insular ways. But beneath it all, Naomi knew something had shifted. Not in the family, but in herself. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another to be publicly reduced to a punchline. She set her glass down with deliberate care, the faintest smile returning to her lips. Grace remained her armor, but the insult had landed. And now, quietly, without anyone noticing, she was preparing to respond. Naomi's smile held, the kind of measured curve that could withstand 1,000 subtle cuts without showing the wound. Her spine stayed tall, her shoulders relaxed, her fingers resting with deliberate grace around the stem of her glass. On the surface, she was unshaken, an elegant fixture in the grand tableau of silver, crystal, and candlelight. But inside, the cousin's words had landed with a dull, heavy weight, dropping into her chest like a stone into still water, sending ripples she didn't let reach her face. She had heard worse before. In quieter rooms, behind closed doors, in conversations that masked cruelty as curiosity. Strangers had questioned her presence beside Daniel. Acquaintances had tried to reframe their marriage as some benevolent act on his part, as though love required a balance sheet. But this was different. This wasn't whispered or hidden. It was public. It was deliberate. And it was staged for an audience. Around the table, the laughter had faded into the polite clinking of cutlery, replaced by the practiced rhythm of a meal in progress. Not a single voice rose in her defense. No one leaned forward to shift the tone or puncture the discomfort hanging over the table. The room had already begun to fold the moment away, tucking it neatly into the unspoken understanding that such remarks were harmless, family humor, not malice. To object would be to disrupt the flow of the evening, to make it a scene. And in the Whitmore world, scenes were worse than sins. Naomi caught Daniel's profile beside her, his jaw tight, his expression fixed forward as though focusing on the far end of the table would keep his temper in check. His silence wasn't apathy. She knew him too well for that. It was calculation. But even so, the lack of open resistance from anyone else at the table made the air feel colder. These people could command boardrooms, direct political donations, and shape public perception with a well-timed op-ed, yet here they sat, letting the insult pass unchallenged because it was wrapped in a toast and laced with laughter. She glanced down at her plate, untouched since the remark. Her fork gleamed against the china, the edge of her napkin still perfectly folded. Every instinct told her to maintain her composure, to let the moment slide past like all the others. But her skin still carried the sting, and not just from the words themselves. It was the performance of it, the way Richard had leaned back in his chair, delivering the line with an actor's timing, inviting the laughter that followed. It was the way others had looked toward her afterward, their expressions a mix of amusement, curiosity, and something she couldn't quite name. She breathed in slowly, steadying herself. The Gala's hum wrapped back around her, the quartet's music smoothing over the jagged edge of the moment. She placed her glass back onto the table with care, the stem making the faintest chime against the crystal coaster. Her smile remained. Her posture didn't falter. She played the part they expected, because tonight their comfort was still the currency of survival. But beneath the satin of her composure, something hard and certain was taking shape. They had shown her exactly where they believed she stood in their hierarchy, and they had no idea that before the night was over, she would answer. The final course had been cleared, leaving only the lingering sweetness of crème brûlée and the faint scent of coffee drifting through the air. The hum of conversation softened as Thomas Whitmore rose once again, tapping the side of his champagne flute with a silver knife. The crystalline ring cut through the music, drawing every eye toward the head of the table. "As we do each year," he began, his voice deep and deliberate. "We open the floor to anyone who wishes to share words with the family, blessings, announcements, reflections. This is your moment." It was a tradition Naomi had heard about but never taken part in. It was, she had been told, a Whitmore custom rooted in togetherness, though she suspected it was more a platform for the family's inner circle to perform their belonging. A waiter appeared with the microphone, sleek and black against the gleam of the table settings. It began its journey down the length of the table, passing from manicured hand to manicured hand. One uncle offered a brief update about a new real estate venture, met with approving nods. An aunt shared an anecdote about her recent travels to Paris, punctuated by delicate laughter. A cousin toasted the family name again, as though it needed yet another endorsement, and the applause came easily, automatically, like muscle memory. Naomi kept her gaze lowered, the stem of her wineglass balanced lightly between her fingers. She had never once been expected to speak during this portion of the evening. Her role was to sit beside Daniel, offer warm smiles at the right moments, and quietly fade into the polished background when the real voices of the family took their turns. But tonight, something was different. The remark from earlier, the one wrapped in laughter and applause, still rested in her chest, solid and unmoving. It hadn't dulled with time. If anything, it had sharpened. And as the microphone drew closer, skipping past one relative, then another, she felt a quiet shift inside her. Not anger. Not even the urge to defend herself. It was something calmer, heavier. A resolve. Her mind began to line up words without her permission, threads of thought weaving themselves together into something that wanted to be spoken. She didn't plan to speak. She had told herself that the most powerful thing she could do tonight was maintain her composure and let the evening pass without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. But as the mic moved down the table, a space began to open in her, the kind of space that can only be filled by truth. The microphone reached the seat beside her, and for a moment she hesitated. Daniel glanced at her, his brow tightening just enough to signal both surprise and warning. But then, with a small, steady movement, she reached out and took it. The weight of it settled in her palm, heavier than she expected. She rose slowly, the soft rustle of her gown cutting through the quiet. Conversation stilled, eyes turned toward her, curiosity rippling through the room. Naomi looked out over the long table, past the flickering candles and the silver platters, past the polished smiles and the watchful portraits on the walls. Her heart was steady, her voice untested in this room but ready. She hadn't planned to speak, until she did. Naomi rose with unhurried grace, the movement smooth and deliberate, as though she had been preparing for this all evening. The silk of her gown whispered against the floor, the faintest rustle marking her passage as she stepped away from the table. Conversations ebbed to a hush, curiosity pulling every gaze toward her. Even the quartet in the corner seemed to pause, their bows hovering above strings as if waiting to hear what she might say. She didn't fidget with the microphone or glance down at her notes, There were none. Her posture was calm, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. She let the quiet settle, knowing instinctively that silence could be as commanding as any speech. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the soft crackle of candle flames and the gentle chime of glassware as someone set down a drink. Her voice, when it came, was warm but unwavering. "I want to thank you all for this evening," she began, her tone carrying easily through the hall without strain. It was the voice of someone speaking to a friend, not an audience, and it made people lean in without realizing it. She smiled faintly as she spoke of the beauty of the night, the generosity of the hosts, and the privilege of sharing in a tradition that spanned generations. It was polite, even gracious, exactly what they expected. But then, like a subtle change in wind, her words began to shift. Her tone deepened, not in volume, but in resonance. "Traditions," she said, letting the word linger, "are powerful. They connect us to where we've come from. They tell the story of who we are, but they can also decide who is allowed to be part of that story and who is not." A ripple passed through the room. No one moved, but Naomi could feel the weight of the attention on her now, heavier, sharper. She didn't flinch. Her eyes swept the table, meeting the gaze of each person who dared to look back. "When we laugh at someone who's different," she continued, "when we reduce them to an idea or a symbol instead of seeing them as a person, we shrink the story instead of growing it." Daniel's hand rested still on the edge of the table, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left her. Across the room, Richard shifted in his seat, suddenly intent on the stem of his wineglass. "I wasn't born into this family," Naomi said, her voice steady as marble. "I came into it through love, love for a man who has shown me what loyalty, kindness, and strength look like. I don't carry your name because I wanted an invitation to this table. I carry it because I wanted to build something with him. But I didn't come here to be a symbol of progress. I came here to be part of a family." Her words were neither angry nor pleading. They were fact, spoken with a clarity that left no space for interruption. She paused just long enough to let the silence absorb them. "And if this family is as strong, as unshakable, as we say it is, then it should have room for every person who loves it enough to call it their own." When she finally lowered the microphone, the room remained silent for a breath too long, the kind of pause that follows when something true has been said and everyone knows it. The quiet was almost louder than applause, and then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. She had not needed to lift her voice, yet her words had landed with the force of something undeniable. Each sentence had been deliberate, the kind that carried its own echo long after it was spoken. Naomi spoke of love, not as something bestowed like an act of charity, but as a conscious, deliberate choice, a commitment between equals, not a favor granted. She spoke of heritage, not as a fortress built to keep others out, but as a bridge that could be crossed from both sides if only people chose to meet in the middle. And then, without hesitation, she dismantled the polite fiction that had hovered in this room for years. She told them plainly that she was not here to be their token of progress, not their diversity project or their box checked in the name of appearances. She was here as their equal. And equality, she reminded them, was not theirs to bestow like a gift. It was hers to claim, because it had always been hers. When she finished, the quiet was absolute. Not the shifting, half-distracted quiet of a party between courses, but a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Naomi could hear the faint electric hum of the chandeliers overhead, the far-off clink of dishes being cleared in another part of the house. In the spaces closest to her, she could hear the subtle catch of breath, the tightening of posture. The same cousins who had laughed earlier now studied their plates as if the intricate china patterns held answers they had never noticed before. The aunt who had greeted her with that paper-thin smile was staring straight ahead, her mouth pressed into a line so fine it was nearly invisible. And there were others, faces Naomi barely knew, that met her gaze now with something different. It might not have been respect, not yet, but it was recognition, awareness, the undeniable sense that they had been seen and, perhaps for the first time, measured. Daniel's eyes had not left her since she began speaking. Now, as the silence stretched on, he exhaled slowly, the faintest curve of pride breaking the tight line of his jaw. She didn't need his approval. Her words had been for herself as much as for anyone else. But she caught it anyway, a small anchor in the vast, unsteady sea of the Whitmore family. No one clapped immediately. That, Naomi thought, was telling. Applause would have been too easy, a way to fold her truth back into their tradition without having to wrestle with it. Instead, the air between them stayed taut, charged with the knowledge that something unspoken had shifted. She placed the microphone gently back on the table, her hand steady. There was no need to rush back to her seat. She took her time, her steps measured, her head high. As she returned to Daniel's side, the scrape of a chair leg broke the quiet. Then, slowly, hesitantly, someone began to clap. It wasn't the enthusiastic burst of a gala toast, but a measured, deliberate rhythm. Others joined, not in a wave, but in a gathering, as if each person had to decide for themselves whether they were ready to stand behind what they'd just heard. Naomi sat, her heart steady, her expression calm. She didn't need their applause any more than she had needed their permission to speak. What mattered was that the words had been said, that they could no longer pretend not to know where she stood. The stillness of the room told her everything she needed to know. They had heard her. And hearing, she knew, was the first step to being unable to forget. Naomi placed the microphone back into the waiting hands of the waiter, her fingers steady, her smile small but unbroken. She turned and walked the length of the table toward her seat beside Daniel, each step unhurried, each movement deliberate. The air seemed to follow her, heavy with the weight of what had just been said. For a moment, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of fabric and the muted hum of the lights overhead. Then, somewhere near the center of the table, a pair of hands began to clap. It was slow at first, almost tentative, as though the room were testing its own response. Another joined in, then another, until the applause began to build, not with the exuberance of celebration, but with the reluctant weight of acknowledgement. It wasn't unanimous. There were still faces that remained still, hands folded tightly in their laps. But enough joined that the sound swelled and filled the room, wrapping around her in a way that felt less like approval and more like an unspoken concession. She eased back into her chair, feeling Daniel's hand find hers beneath the table. His grip was warm, firm, and wordless. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The pride was in the pressure of his fingers, in the quiet exhale he released as if letting go of something he had been holding for a long time. The rest of the evening moved on, but it was different now. The conversations were quieter, the laughter more measured, as though everyone had been reminded of an invisible line they hadn't realized they'd crossed before. Naomi finished her glass of wine without rushing, engaging in polite conversation when spoken to, but no longer making the effort to dissolve into the background. She didn't need to. Later, when the last toast had been made and the final guests began to filter out into the night, she stepped through the grand double doors and onto the marble terrace. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint tang of the sea. The night sky stretched wide above the estate, the stars unobstructed by the ballroom's chandeliers. She drew in a deep breath, the kind that felt like it reached all the way down to her bones. She knew the portraits inside would remain the same. Rows of pale faces in gilded frames, unmoving and unchanging. But something had shifted tonight. The air in that room was different now, the way a space feels after a storm has rolled through. She hadn't just defended herself. She had left her imprint, a truth that couldn't be painted over or forgotten. And as she descended the terrace steps with Daniel at her side, her head was high, her stride steady. The story those walls told might not change, but from tonight on, it would never be the whole story again. If this story struck a chord, don't keep it to yourself. Somewhere, someone has walked into a room like Naomi did, watched, judged, and waiting for them to stumble. And they need to be reminded that holding your ground can shift the air around you. Share your own experience in the comments and subscribe for more stories that prove respect can speak louder than status.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.